Black African applicants had much lower offer rates than white applicants.
The outcomes weren't equal.
No, that pointed to potential bias in the admissions process.
Black and Asian candidates were less likely to be shortlisted and hired compared to white candidates. There was a highly qualified British Muslim Asian candidate who was ultimately deemed unsuitable. So this paper from 2013 looks at one university in central England.
They gave it a fake name, of course, for anonymity.
Right, Midshire University.
Yeah, Midshire University.
Okay, so anyone listening who is a student or staff member, or just anyone who cares about, equity and inclusion, this is going to be pretty insightful, I think.
The paper breaks down institutional racism into 10 components. So let's start with indirect discrimination. So did the researchers find any evidence of that at Midshire? Black African applicants had much lower offer rates than white applicants, even when you control for qualification. And Black students were also more likely to withdraw from full-time programs. And then across all ethnicities, there were pretty significant gaps in degree attainment.
So white students were more likely to graduate?
Yeah, and with good honors.
Wow, so even though there were a lot of minority students at Midshire, the outcomes weren't equal?
No, not at all. And I think that suggests the possibility of, indirect discrimination.
Like, there are these systemic barriers in place that are disproportionately affecting certain groups.
Right. It's not that someone's intentionally, trying to keep certain students out or down.
Right.
But there's something in the system that's creating that inequality. So the researchers also uncovered some anecdotal evidence that pointed to potential bias in the admissions process.
Right. Yeah, that's right. They found instances where admissions tutors were making decisions about students without clear, objective criteria.
Which is very subjective.
Exactly.
What about employment practices?
Okay.
Did the researchers find similar issues when looking at, how staff were treated?
This area gets a little more complex.
Okay.
Unfortunately, Midshire wasn't great at collecting and analyzing staff data related to race and ethnicity. A 2008 report found that they were actually in breach of their legal duties to monitor equality in employment practices. Well, one of the few reports they did conduct in 2001 found that both Black and Asian candidates were less likely to be shortlisted and hired compared to white candidates.
Really?
Yeah. And then a later report in 2008 showed that this pattern continued, particularly for routine jobs.
It's so frustrating because even when you have these formal procedures in place, on paper it looks like everything should be fair. There's still room for bias to creep in.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Are we actually living up to what we say we're doing?
Exactly. Exactly. And the researcher actually observed a case of potential bias firsthand.
Oh, really?
Yeah. While sitting on a hiring panel for a lecturer in law position. There was a highly qualified British Muslim Asian candidate who was ultimately deemed unsuitable.
Wow.
Not because of his qualifications or experience, because the course leader expressed concerns about his sense of humor.
Well, and whether he would relate to students.
Yeah, like would the students get his jokes?
I mean, how do you even measure that?
It's very subjective.
It's extremely subjective.
Yeah.
And I feel like that could easily be masking other biases. Right, like, oh, he doesn't have the right personality or whatever.
Yeah.
But actually, it's just, that person is different.
Exactly.
And they're not comfortable with that.
Right.
So we've talked about student admissions and staff recruitment.
Yeah.
But what about the overall occupational culture at Midshire?
Right.
Was racism just openly tolerated? Or was there a genuine effort to create an inclusive environment?
So the researcher interviewed a number of Black and minority ethnic staff members. And their experiences were quite varied. Yeah, the minority staff at the university were much less likely to report experiencing that kind of outright blatant racism. Some even hesitated to frame their negative experiences in those terms.
Interesting.
Their experiences were often more subtle, like feeling patronized or hyper-scrutinized or stereotyped.
Right, so it's like a feeling of not truly belonging.
Exactly.
Of being the other.
Yes, that feeling of otherness.
In a predominantly white space.
Exactly, and that feeling was especially pronounced among support staff compared to academic staff.
Interesting.
Which raises some questions about the different power dynamics. And working environments within the university. The researcher suggests one key factor is something called whiteness.
Whiteness.
Yeah.
What does that even mean in this context?
It's not just about being white, right? It's about how whiteness becomes the unspoken norm.
The default setting.
Yeah, the default setting in these institutions.
So you're saying like white people, white culture, white ways of thinking and doing things just become so dominant
Right.
that they're almost invisible.
Exactly, especially to those who benefit from them.
It's like we don't even see it anymore.
Yeah, it's like the air we breathe. We don't even notice it's there until it's polluted.
Right.
And this unmarked whiteness, as the researcher calls it, I think really helps to explain why racial inequalities persist even in institutions that, claim to value diversity.
Because if you don't even see the problem,
Right.
you're not going to try and fix it.
Exactly. And this was really apparent at Midshare for many white staff members. The
Yeah.
whiteness of the university just went unnoticed.
It was just normal.
Yeah, it was just normal.
But for minority staff and students,
Right.
it was a constant reminder that,
You don't belong.
yeah, they didn't quite fit in.
That you're the other.
Yeah.
Precisely. And that sense of otherness was made even worse by the lack of representation in leadership roles.
Right, which we talked about earlier.
Exactly.
The fact that there were hardly any Black or Asian people in positions of power
Yeah,
just reinforced that idea that whiteness was the path to success.
exactly. It's a vicious cycle.
Did the university take any steps to promote inclusion and, address these issues, even if they weren't as overt as in other institutions?
They did take some steps, yeah. For example, they created a multi-faith chaplaincy.
Okay.
They provided prayer facilities. They celebrated diverse religious festivals.
Mm-hmm.
They even had an equality and diversity lecture series and an annual week dedicated to these topics.
So on the surface, that sounds like progress.
Yeah, they were making visible efforts
Right.
to promote diversity.
But were these initiatives actually effective in promoting real inclusion?
That's the key question, and the researcher found that despite being labeled multi-faith, the chaplaincy still centered on Christianity in many ways.
So maybe alienating individuals from other faith backgrounds?
Yeah, exactly. So it
Indeed.
seems like true inclusion requires a deeper shift in mindset and power structures,
Right.
rather than just ticking boxes and implementing these superficial changes.
Right. You can't just slap a diversity label on something and call it a day.
Exactly.
You have to actually,
Yeah.
make fundamental changes
Exactly.
to the way the institution operates.
Yeah, and I have a feeling that's where we're going to see Midshare continue to fall short.
Okay.
We've covered student experiences, employment practices, the overall culture,
Right.
but there's one glaring issue we haven't addressed yet.
Which
It's
is?
representation in leadership.
Right. What did that look like at Midshare?
Well, this is where the picture gets even more disheartening.
Okay.
Senior management at Midshare remained overwhelmingly white.
Really?
Yeah, the vice chancellor, all the pro-vice chancellors, all the heads of support departments.
All white.
Yeah, all white.
So it's like looking at a black and white photo in a world of color.
Yeah.
Did the university make any attempt to address this lack of diversity at the top?
Unfortunately, not really. There weren't any significant efforts to recruit Black and Asian individuals into senior positions.
Oh.
In fact, on the governing council, where they did have 2 minority representatives who had been appointed, the ex-chair commented that this was more than enough, claiming they actually had a higher representation than their proportion in the general population.
That's incredible. It's incredibly tone deaf, especially considering all the evidence we've just discussed,
Yeah. Right.
about the inequalities that minority staff and students are facing.
Exactly.
It doesn't sound like promoting race equality was a genuine priority at Midshare.
You're right, it wasn't. And this lack of regency is evident in a number of ways.
It's so frustrating.
Yeah, it is. And it's a cycle that's very difficult to break, especially when there's a lack of urgency to even acknowledge the problem.
Right. Like they just completely ignored that McPherson report.
Oh, right. And they forgot about their own race equality plan.
So it's like they were living in a bubble of denial.
Yeah, they were.
So what can be done if universities are so resistant to change? I mean, is there any hope for creating more equitable and inclusive institutions?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
The researcher argues that universities need to go beyond what they call cosmetic change.
Cosmetic change. So like,
Yeah.
having a diversity statement on their website, but not actually doing anything.
Exactly like having a multi-faith chaplaincy or celebrating Black History Month.
Mm-hmm.
Those things are important, but they're not enough.
It's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg.
Right. We need to address the root causes.
The underlying structures.
Yeah, the underlying structures of power and privilege that allow these inequalities to flourish.
So what are some concrete steps that universities can take to actually address these underlying structures?
That's a great question, and the researcher offers several key areas for action.
Like, where do we even begin to tackle something so complex?
Well, one of the first things I think universities need to do is get serious about collecting and analyzing data
Okay.
on race and ethnicity.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We saw how Midshare was terrible at that. They were
Yeah.
basically flying blind when it came to understanding the experiences of their own employees.
Exactly. And it's not just about students, it's about staff as well. We need that data, to identify patterns of inequality.
To hold institutions accountable.
Exactly.
Yeah, you can't argue with numbers.
Right? Numbers speak volumes,
Yeah.
and they can be a powerful tool.
Okay, so what else can universities do?
Another crucial step, I think, is investing in high-quality training
Okay.
on race and racism for all staff.
And make it mandatory.
Yeah, not optional.
Yeah, everybody needs to be on board with this.
Everyone needs to be on board, and this training shouldn't just be a one-off event.
Right, it needs to be ongoing.
Right, ongoing and integrated into professional development.
Because unlearning years of implicit bias
Yeah,
takes time.
it takes time and consistent effort.
Yeah, it's like learning a new language or a skill you have to
Right,
practice.
practice and reinforcement.
Right.
Okay, now another crucial area I think where universities need to step up is creating clear pathways for minority staff
Yeah.
to advance into leadership positions.
The lack of representation at the top was a major issue at Midshare.
Yeah, a huge issue.
It sends such a negative message when people of color don't see themselves
Right.
reflected in those leadership roles.
And it reinforces that idea that they're not qualified or capable of leading,
Right.
which is not true.
And it perpetuates that whole culture of whiteness.
Exactly.
Yeah, that we talked about.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So universities need to actively recruit and mentor minority staff
Right.
and remove any barriers that might be preventing them from reaching their full potential. Finally, and this is perhaps one of the most challenging but also one of the most essential steps,
Okay.
is creating a culture of open and honest dialogue.
About race.
Yeah, about race and racism.
That's got to be so difficult, though,
Yeah, it can be incredibly difficult in a university setting.
where people are, afraid to say the wrong thing
Right.
or be labeled as too sensitive or whatever.
And that's why it's crucial to create safe spaces
Okay.
for these conversations where
Mhm.
people can learn from each other, challenge their own assumptions, and really engage with the complexities of race and racism.
If you found this duck dive insightful, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next exploration of complex and timely topics.